This is Duke University.
It's a pleasure to be here and to see such a wonderful turnout for this event. The Faculty Bookwatch is one of our favorite events. Srinivas Aravamudan is Professor of English, Romance Studies, and in the Literature program, the current president of the Consortium of Humanities Centers and Institutes from 2007 to 12 and then 2014 to the present, and the first vice president of the American Society of 18th-Century Studies. Formerly the Dean of the Humanities at Duke University and the Director of the Franklin Humanities Institute, his areas of expertise include 18th century British and French literature, post-colonial studies, and literary theory. His many books and publications have garnered him many accolades, including his book, Tropicopolitans, Colonialism and Agency, 1688 to 1804, Duke University Press, published in 1999. It won the Outstanding First Book Prize of the Modern Language Association in 2000. His most recent book, Enlightenment Orientalism, Resisting the Rise of the Novel, University of Chicago Press 2012, reveals how Oriental tales, pseudo-ethnographies, sexual fantasies, and political satires took Europe by storm during the 18th century. Naming this body of fiction Enlightenment Orientalism, he poses a range of urgent questions that uncover the interdependence of Oriental tales and domestic fiction, thereby challenging standard scholarly narratives about the rise of the novel. The book has received much critical praise, winning the Choice Magazine Choice Outstanding Academic Title of the Year, the Kensher Prize for the Center of 18th Century Studies at Indiana University, and the International Society for the Study of Narratives George and Barbara Perkins Prize. Srinivas is so much more than his scholarship, however. He's been an international pioneer in advancing the work of the humanities. He has designed new ways to engage undergraduates in humanities scholarship. As Rick Powell has noted, Srinivas developed the idea of cultivating faculty research through emerging networks in the humanities, as well as new partnerships with historically Black colleges and universities. And he has been a very welcoming partner with the libraries in so many ways that have brought benefits to our students, faculty, and to Duke in general. I'd like to conclude my introduction with a quote from Dean Laurie Patton, who said it so well. Srinivas's extraordinary leadership has allowed Duke to develop a signature unlike any other in the humanities and higher education. As a scholar, as a former director of the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute, as the architect of the Humanities Writ Large program, and through his leadership with the CHCI, he has been instrumental in extending Duke's global presence and identity as an institution building international and global humanities networks.
Please forgive my accent. Please tolerate it in the name of pseudo-ethnography, as Srinivas would put it. So let me begin with a sincere thank you to Srinivas Aravamudan for his resisting what he calls the Whiggish rise of the novel thesis, a thesis that he goes on to say tells very selective story about fictional genres, and I will focus on the subtitle of Srinivas's book. For those of us trying to imagine a less selective and less parochial theory of the novel than the British one famously proposed in 1957 by Ian Watt, Srinivas Aravamudan's Enlightenment Orientalism is an inspiring book. It helps us to understand, to begin, how, and I quote, earlier Renaissance English fiction included major influences from Spanish and Italian sources, not to mention the internal dialogue with ancient Greek and Roman fiction and Near Eastern sources. It would be much better for investigations into the history of the novel, continues Aravamudan, to operate under the premise that fictions seem largely indifferent to the question of national origin until the mid-18th century. The problem with English theories of the novel may have begun when, in the 18th century for Ian Watt, between the 17th and the 18th century for the OED, around 1740 for the disturbingly precise Michael McKeown, the word novel began to acquire the precise meaning of a narrative distinct from what the English language had called until then romance. So in good part of continental Europe, the word roman or romanzo, with which both new and old fictions were called, implied a continuity between the tradition of medieval, Renaissance, chivalric, and Oriental romances on the one hand, and on the other, the new forms of narration that emerged in the 18th century to entertain a fairly new bourgeois public, depending on the products of the printing presses. In England, instead, the word novel, from the Latin novus, perhaps more than from the Italian novella, suggested a historical break with past forms of entertainment based upon marvelous and uncommon incidents, to use the words of Walter Scott's 1824 essay on romance. It ushered in a novel era, or mutatis mutandis, the era of the novel, in which, as the same Walter Scott put it, a radically new breed of fiction narrated now the ordinary train of human events and the modern state of society. And if the word novel, now distinct from roman or romanzo, suggested a historical break with past forms of fabulation, it also suggested a geographical one, a break, namely, with the literatures written in vulgar Romance languages, with Chrétien de Troyes' Maître roman, with Dante's Prose di Romanzi, and so on. In fact, for the theorists of the rise and later origins, in the plural, of the novel, it was precisely the insular and insulated British novel, Defoe's and Richardson for Watt, Fielding's and Richardson for McKeon, that took it as its most pious and solemn task, that of narrating the modern state of society, or, in Watt's most eager words, of reflecting the characteristic orientation of modern thought, formal realism, that is to say. As Enlightenment Orientalism puts it, the English novel became, after 1957, the tautology of the theory of the novel tout court, a tautology, needless to say, that many have resisted since. I need to drink even if I'm running out of time. Margaret Doody, for instance, recalling the Satyricon and the Golden Age, claimed that the planet of the novel had risen long before Defoe and Richardson, and had in fact already been occupied by, her words, a continuous and comprehensive history of about 2,000 years. Franco Moretti, too, in an attempt to make the atlas of the novel longer, larger, and deeper, went back to Heliodorus of Emesa, whose novels from around the 3rd century had already been singled out by Erwin Rode in the Greek novel and its precursors of 1876. The problem with this kind of operations, however, was that they risked turning the specificity of the novel as a genre, to put it in Aristotelian jargon, into a universal mode of narration that had always existed and forever will. It lost sight, in other words, of the ways in which narrative forms and forms of entertainment did change in history, how Renaissance romanzo and Baroque roman evolved into forms that are still roman and romanzo, but are now ready to accommodate a new bourgeois taste. Neither Doody nor Moretti tell us how classical rules of decorum broke down to make room for a new form and why. Neither tells us what the relation was, if any, between a Hegelian world already prosaically ordered and the new roman representing a Bakhtinian universe already novelized, or how a new bourgeois civilization, fragmented, as Schiller once put it, in a more rigorous separation of ranks and occupations, transformed the classical poetics of epic harmony into a new kind of fiction, whose novel task was, to say with Lukács, to carry the fragmentary nature of its social world structure into the world of forms. That is why Srinivas's way of resisting the rise of the novel seems to me so much more profitable and useful than many others. The goal of Enlightenment Orientalism is not to stretch the novel to some primordial point of origin, nor, as the title of this book could misleadingly suggest, to relocate its rise to the Levant. The issue, rather, is to single out in the same 18th century that saw the rise, if not of the novel, at least of a new public of readers, a field of tensions between realism and fantasy, between literary attempts to forge some kind of national subject on the one hand, and on the other, the Oriental quest for the pseudo-ethnographic encounter with cultural differences. The goal of Enlightenment Orientalism, in short, seems to me precisely that of pointing to the fragmentary status of fictional forms in Enlightenment Europe. As Srinivas writes, to separate novels as realist fictions of the main line from Oriental tales and romances set aside as deficient precursors of accidental subgenres, ignores how prose-fictional genres responded in different ways to questions raised at the same time about the value of fictional and non-fictional narrative. What was the new bourgeois public of Vian Watt reading Robinson Crusoe or The 1001 Night, or both? And to what end, and to respond to which questions? Speaking of questions, here is mine for Srinivas. Reading Enlightenment Orientalism, I could not help but noticing, or perhaps misreading, a final moment of indecision. On the one hand, there is an attempt, as for instance in the passage I just quoted, to resist the paradigmatic procedure of the rise of the novel theory, namely to separate novels as realist fictions from Oriental tales and romances. In this sense, the realist and the fantastic, the national and the ethnographic, the search for the individual subjects and the quest for the other, would be the two poles within which the new fictional genre moved. In this, Aravamudan's book, I don't know why I keep going from Srinivas to Aravamudan, is in line with a growing body of criticism. Dorrit Cohn's The Distinction of Fiction, Nicholas Page Before Fiction, Leonard Davis' Factual Fictions, Catherine Gallagher's The Rise of Fictionality, and we could go on, that seeks to re-examine the rise of the novel by moving away from the focus on realism and considering instead the development of fictionality. On the other hand, however, there seems to be a moment in which Enlightenment Orientalism ends up yielding to the very paradigm it promised to resist, and the Oriental fiction becomes, if not a subgenre, at least one prose-fictional genre different than the novel. Take this passage as an example. Novelistic culture gained in strength and identity by setting itself off as domestic authenticity against Enlightenment Orientalism and against other forms of romance and prose fiction. Are then The 1001 Night or the Turkish spy novels or merely other forms? And if the latter has not the paradigm of realism as the conditio sine qua non of the novel, kicked out from the door, re-enter from another. The impression grows that the paradigm of the rise of the novel was only quantitatively false. Contrary to what, there were other non-realistic and non-autochthonous forms competing with the realist novel in Britain for dominance and hegemony. These other forms were as widely read as the realist novel and were produced in numbers. And yet, after all is said and done, qualitatively, Watt's realist novel still affirms itself, albeit after Enlightenment Orientalism in the 1780s and as Srinivas adds, as a humbling rather than triumphalist rise of realism, as the form that changes the history of literature and the very way we understand such history. No doubt, this change happens because, as Srinivas writes, different forms of narrative have been suppressed or forgotten because of recently acquired chronocentric, national realist, and xenophobic norms. And yet, the change seems to happen nonetheless. Can we resist, then, what seems to be a given? Or shouldn't we resist, instead, the very idea of a rise of realism, whether humbling or triumphal, at a moment in history when precisely the reality of facts that in classical times distinguished the historian from the poet and the latter from the tragedian is dramatically called into question? When in the world of the novel, that is to say, every fact becomes but the opinion of one Tristram Shandy, and the solidity of the real, once universally recognized as such, begins to melt into the air of Schiller's sentimentality, or into the point of view, to say it with Koselleck, of a historicized world irremediably fragmented in its own particulars. Can we question precisely the idea of realism in the novel?
When I started to formulate some thoughts about what to say about Enlightenment Orientalism, I found myself thinking back to my first encounter with Srinivas Aravamudan's work in the form of his first book, Tropicopolitans. And I remember the excitement of encountering a new and profoundly original voice. It's a book that is distinguished by its critical sophistication and its erudition, but also by something that I find to be much rarer, which is that it really makes some moves. There are real moves that are made in this book. The concept of the tropicopolitan, one of Srinivas's many really arresting and thought-provoking coinages, invites us to expand our notion of cosmopolitan citizenship to encompass the inhabitants of the tropical colonies of the Americas. It imagines the political agency of the colonized and the enslaved, not by the retro projection of fully vested anti-colonial politics or a fully developed commitment to human rights, but through a much more guarded, but at the same time, in some ways, tremendously optimistic theory of performative reading, a theory of reading that is, I guess, dialectical in its connection of the past and the present. And this is a theory of reading that comes up again in Enlightenment Orientalism, where Srinivas affirms at one moment his belief, his commitment to what he calls the radical contingency of reading, the power of reading in the present to unleash something new that operates in a very kind of complex temporality. So since my first very enthusiastic encounter with tropicopolitans, I have repeatedly been energized by Srinivas's work, which has covered some of the same ground as my own, Orientalism, colonialism, slavery, and some of the same texts and authors, and which I've always found to have the merit of very thoughtfully and very astutely redirecting debates that have lost their momentum or gone off track onto new grounds. This is certainly the case with Enlightenment Orientalism, which intervenes in the long-standing, often polemical debate about the status of Western representations of the East. In the wake of Said, critics of various political and theoretical schools have attempted to describe the kind of work that Orientalism does, to pin down its intentions, to pin down its effects, not, of course, necessarily the same thing. Where Said emphasized complicity with colonial institutions and ideologies, counter-attackers such as Bernard Lewis and Robert Irwin defended the Orientalists' curiosity about other cultures as a symptom of the West's open and democratic political culture. Other scholars, in more finely grained analyses, have weighed the relation between discourse and counter-discourse, arguing either that literature is inevitably recuperated by political ideology, or conversely, that it is defined precisely by its capacity to exceed authorial intentions and the ideological horizons of its moment. Striking out in a new or in an earlier direction, perhaps, Enlightenment Orientalism makes what, I think I'm stuck between the Srinivas and the Aravamudan too, but Srinivas acknowledges to be, to some ears, a heretical claim that 18th century French and British Orientalism is driven not by proto-colonial and ethnocentrist attitudes, but by a genuine engagement with the cultures of the East, which is not to say, of course, that it's politically innocent, and Srinivas makes this point many times, but that the driving force is not something that one could easily render as proto-colonial. So in the defense, or in the elaboration and defense of this position, Enlightenment Orientalism makes a series of ancillary claims, and it seems stupid to call them ancillary because they're such massive claims that there's nothing ancillary or secondary about them. They're claims with very far-reaching and provocative literary, historical, theoretical, and political implications. So in a very schematic way, I'm just going to summarize a few of them, what I see as the main ones. So Enlightenment Orientalism observes that the genres of 18th century Orientalism have been widely dismissed as frivolous and ornamental. They are considered to be incidental, if not detrimental, to what is sometimes ponderously called the serious business of the Enlightenment. Srinivas argues, to the contrary, that these genres performed, and I would quote him here, a misunderstood yet crucial function in relation to the public culture of the Enlightenment and political modernity. He holds that Orientalist fiction and Enlightenment were interwoven, since the former's transcultural perspective and epistemological skepticism were important catalysts for political and religious critique. Contra some scholars, he rejects the view that the Orient is mere allegorical window dressing. That, for example, when someone like Montesquieu writes about Persia, he is really only ever speaking about France. And this is an argument sometimes made in defense of Montesquieu. So it doesn't really matter, how bad whatever Montesquieu may have said about Persia is, because he didn't mean it. He was really talking about France. And Srinivas will have none of that and says not so. Okay, point 2. So Enlightenment Orientalism was embodied in a proliferation of prose fiction genres that tapered off as one form. The novel became dominant, as we've just been hearing. This narrowing of literature had several corollary effects. Whereas Oriental tales examined Europe in conjunction with other cultures, testing out various modes of universalism and particularism, the novel is, I'm not too clear about that, focused on the nation state, the domestic interior, the self. This line of thinking takes two directions, and I think that perhaps, and maybe you will comment on this, they may somewhat be in tension throughout the book. So one is the claim that 18th century fiction retreated defensively into the novel. The other, the claim that 18th century scholarship has retrospectively foreclosed on these various fictional genres by focusing unduly on the rise of the novel. I feel that both of these claims are made and overlap and sometimes pull apart. The third point, so if Enlightenment Orientalism proposes a counter-genealogy to literary histories that explicitly or implicitly consecrate the novel as the apogee, the telos of fictional form, it also engages with current theories of world literature that also focus exclusively on the novel. Srinivas argues that such theories apply effectively a stage theory of development to literary history with the novelist telos, while also subscribing to a diffusionist model of circulation. Finally, the displacement of tales by the novel has aesthetic and epistemological implications. It entails the privileging of psychology and explanation over action, predication and reader interpretation over, I have to start that again. The privileging of psychology and explanation over action, predication, and reader interpretation. This is something that Srinivas develops from Tsvetan Todorov's discussion of narrative forms. The privileging of the novel also, he argues, entails a powerful stabilization of what fiction is and how it relates to the real, what we mean by fiction and what we mean by the real. So these are big claims, and I find them persuasive, both in their political ambitions and in the detailed and rhetorically elegant manner in which they are argued. And as we were speaking before about this, and of course many of you have read Srinivas extensively, he is, apart from anything else, an extraordinary writer, a wordsmith who does theory, for whom theory materializes, on the level of the word. But setting aside the pleasure of the text, the pleasures of his text, I have a few questions. So I wrote 4 questions, and if you can even get to one, that would be great. So, okay. So the first has to do maybe with I don't know. A little bit of rhetorical overstatement, or the deployment of what Certeau would call a repoussoir. So at times, the Enlightenment Orientalism feels a little bit like a post-colonial rescue narrative, along the lines of the brown tale as being rescued from the white novel that is complicit with nationalism and colonialism. So I guess the question, there are a multiplicity of questions. How strongly will you defend this view of the novel? To what extent do you in fact view the novel as a genre with a set of properties that you describe? To what extent it is just a label that gathers together many different fictional forms, many different kinds of novel, epistolary, serial, the list goes on and on. So along similar lines, the 19th century comes off rather badly in the book as the moment when Orientalism goes over to colonialism. It territorializes and utopia comes to an end. So I wonder what you would say, for example, about the survival in somewhat new forms of what appear to be recycled 18th century genres in 19th century Orientalism. So I'm thinking about, okay, there are more travel narratives, but the very strange travel narrative, very deterritorialized, in a way pseudo-ethnographic of someone like Nerval, or the resurgence of the conte fantastique under the Second Empire. And of course, Nerval is, his narrative is replete with all kinds of embedded Oriental tales. So are these counter-narratives? Are they holdouts from a repressed, tradition of 18th century Orientalism? So the second question, since I come from a primarily French background, and I want to acknowledge first that one of the main deprovincializing things that your work has done is to bring Britain and France closer together, not just, the Levant and Europe or Creoles and Europeans, but Britain and France. You've really thought them together more than many scholars, and certainly much more than I. I guess, the rise of the novel theory works more, and it has had more currency in the British context. So is it a straw man if we bring it up in the French context? Okay, I'm being told I have 1 minute, so this is my last question. So the last question bears on the meaning of transcultural, which comes up a lot in the book. So I think that transcultural is a term that's used to mean a number of different things, to speak of texts or practices or ideas that have moved from one place to another and been transformed in the process. It can also mean, and this is a bit of a stronger meaning, something or someone who straddles or moves between two cultures. In other words, where there's some degree of ongoing multi-directionality. So I think that in Enlightenment Orientalism, you use transcultural to mean Europeans viewing themselves from the outside, and you also use transcultural to mean the circulation of Arabic, Indian, Persian tales in Europe. You don't talk much about bilateral processes of exchange or intellectual contact zones. So I want to ask you about that, not least because this is a recurrent question in the afterlives of Orientalism. And remember how strikingly and starkly Said dismisses the Orient as absent from Orientalism and a non-question. He says, I have nothing to say about the brute materiality, precisely that expression, of Oriental lives. And it's a question that keeps recurring in different forms with different contributions to the question of transculturation. So I raise it again here in response to my reading of your book, which I just say in closing, I love, I admire, and has been a very powerful influence on my thinking.
The two terms of his title are both contested terrain, hotly debated on both sides. I'll begin with Enlightenment, which, although commonly associated with science and secularity, has had a bad press, and not only in recent years. In the 18th century itself, Hamann and Jacobi already led a quasi-religious subjectivist reaction against an Enlightenment they saw as desiccated, rationalistic, narrow-minded, and reductive. This strand of anti-Enlightenment thinking persists all the way to Adorno and Horkheimer, whose dialectic of enlightenment attacks it as instrumental thinking rather than the operation of reason itself as such. None of these thinkers attack it as Eurocentric, but the Iranian term Westoxification expresses that more recent critique in a comprehensive way, in which secular mass culture and permissiveness become the result of Enlightenment's various campaigns of demystification. In general, it would seem to me that the fundamental target of Enlightenment is in fact religion itself, but you can make that more palatable if you translate religion as superstition and leave it at that. The accusation of Eurocentrism, however, seems to me the most feeble version of all this. It's generally a code word for anti-Marxism, but you may also well ask whether using the automobile, going to the movies, or listening to symphonies are Eurocentric activities. At a moment when Europe has become little more than a glittering museum and America pulls practically all the strings, it doesn't seem particularly relevant to use this term any longer of Eurocentrism. And within Europe, there would also be some distinctions to be made. England does not think of itself as European. For example, Depeche's book might better have been titled Provincializing Western Europe. The Germans were not really part of the West until after World War II. The Balkans have always had a peculiarly ambiguous status. Metternich once famously said that Asia begins at the Landstrasse. And everyone thinks of Stalin as an Oriental despot, so this may be the moment to pass to the other word in Srinivas's title, the Orient and Orientalism. Geographical designations like the West and the East are as contingent and untheorizable as the categories of left and right for the individual body. They have no philosophical meaning, and yet the result of that lack is that they're immediately endowed with a variety of very concrete ideological meanings. As we know, left left means sinister, untouchable, abnormal, louche, and all the rest. In the case of the East, it's even more complicated since everyone's East keeps moving further east. Everyone has an East of their own East. And ultimately, one has to evoke the more abstract category of otherness in order to make any sensible judgments. Besides this, inasmuch as we seem to be creatures permanently condemned to the ethical binary, the opposition of good and bad, the latter becomes infinitely reversible, and alongside Orientophobia of the type Said famously denounced, there's also appears Orientophilia, which ought to be just as disreputable. If the Greeks invented Orientalism, which I doubt, it must also be remembered that Alexander the Great was an Orientophile, and that his was a bilingual empire whose ruler dressed like a Persian and adopted their far more advanced civilization. But of course, he wasn't really a Greek in the first place. I always cite as the first great example of Orientalism in Western literature that dramatic moment in the Iliad, it's book 3, I think, in which Menelaus catches sight of Paris and challenges him to individual combat. He was glad, like the lion who comes on a mighty carcass in his hunger, chancing on the body of a horned stag. But Alexandros, that's Paris, Alexandros the godlike, when he saw Menelaus showing among the champions, his heart was shaken within him. The West, the Greek brute force and the passion for war. The East, Troy, Paris, fearful in his physical grace, effeminate, given over to luxury and eroticism. Appropriately enough, he's caught up in a cloud by the goddess Venus and rescued from certain death, whisked away from the combat. Here, clearly, it's Troy that, like Persia, is the advanced culture, the advanced civilization, and the Greeks who are the barbarians, just like the Crusaders after them. So you can make a case for Orientalism being at one with patriarchy as an ideology, and probably you could also argue for its kinship with anti-Semitism as well. The odd thing is that, like racism, the positive is capable of switching places with a negative at a moment's notice, and vice versa. The East is the more advanced culture, but it's also the place of backwardness, ignorance. It's dirty and wretched and so forth, while the good, non-Oriental Western representative is often little more than an ugly brute, as in my Homeric example. I would have liked to pursue the matter further by arguing that such stereotypes may be deplorable, but they're both inevitable and indispensable when we have to do with groups or collectivities. All notion of this or that national identity, for example, are Orientalistic in that sense. On the other hand, anyone who travels cannot avoid feeling, however briefly, that there may be something in them. Our relationship to such group perception is, in other words, allegorical. There is no scientific way of escaping these pseudo-ideas or these ideological stereotypes. In fact, however, cultural prestige often follows political and economic power. And as far as literature is concerned, in the very period that concerns us here, one of the greatest novels of history is being written in far-off China. It's The Red Chamber Dream, composed in the 1780s and 90s, a time frame which brings us at once to our next topic. First of all, the so-called Great Divergence. It's been argued recently that China in the 18th century was the richest country in the world, that all the gold and silver that slipped through the fingers of the Spanish conquistadors ultimately over time made its way to the Far East and stayed there. This tremendous cultural and civilizational superiority may go some way towards accounting for the prestige of the Oriental tale in that far-off and provincial peninsula called Europe. But it also takes us a certain distance towards explaining the immense reversal in which Europe invents Orientalism. For Orientalism in its more recent Saidian form is itself but the dialectical reverse and flip side of an even more disreputable pseudo-concept, which is that of modernity, itself then obviously also very closely related to that of Orientalism, of Enlightenment. I'm not the only one, or even the first, to have denounced the very idea of modernity without being able to do anything about it. So as it seems to be a term and a concept as impossible to do without as it is unacceptable. My proposal, however, has always been very practical. Why not simply call it capitalism? Everything ideological about the notion of modernity falls away, or I should say, falls into place, once one realizes that what's thus meant is simply the development of capitalism itself, whose emergence, it's capitalism whose emergence makes the difference of the divergence, capitalism whose dissolution of traditional social forms makes of the 18th century so unclassifiable an alleged transitional stage or moment, capitalism which gives us so peculiar a literary form as the novel, but the concept of capitalism is then, of course, at once itself denounced as Eurocentric, so we'll let that be. As for the novel, I do happen to be a devotee of this form, but I don't feel particularly threatened by Srinivas's attack on realism. But I do want to salute his extraordinary inventiveness, not only in rediscovering a kind of positive Orientalism in the West in the form of a non-Western stereotype of wisdom and rationality, but even more in rewriting the Western notion of the conte oriental in a new way. His book underscores indeed and indeed reveals the intimate relationship between Orientalist Enlightenment, in other words, the Western version of the Oriental tale, and the plot of espionage. It's essentially this relationship, in other words, which seals the connection, the equivalence in the 18th century between Orientalism and Enlightenment, which will in the 19th century become opposites of each other. For the spy seeks knowledge. The spy is the operator of demystification, of pursuing appearances back into their causes, of uncovering the truth behind the mystery and the meaning behind the intrigue. The Orientalist spy is, in other words, the ancestor of the private detective or the honest policeman in modern procedurals. It's through him that the social totality comes to light. And although I've actually often said so myself as a reader of these things, it's appropriate here to quote a genuine authority, our greatest contemporary mystery writer on the subject. The crime novel, he tells us, is more than a puzzle and an entertainment. It is societal reflection, documentation, and investigation. But the subject demands an object, and to the spy as an agent and an acton, a subject of knowledge, corresponds the conspiracy as the essence of the object and the very structure of society itself. So it is that in the 18th century Conte Oriental, the erotic and the political can be at one. The harem is the same as the court of the despot. The same truth holds sway in private and in public. This now accounts for what Srinivas sees as restricted and alienated in Western novelistic realism. How can a photograph of the Krupp factory, Brecht asks us, convey the truth of the Krupp enterprise and of capitalism itself? The 19th century family firm, even the condition of the workers in Zola's mines or in American meatpacking plants, these are still the limited as objects, too limited as objects to give us the genuine truth of the thing. We have to wait until the great monopolies have become transnational corporations, larger than any nation state, to be once again confronted with entities capable of disclosing the ultimate truths, the absolute idea of capitalism. But in the 18th century, such truths are political and not yet economic. And we now need to remember that Orientalism is also the origin or of the image or even caricature of the political despot, of that ideology of absolute political power, which fear and censorship prevent you from disclosing in the Western monarchies. The caricatural East of the sultans, the intrigues, political and erotic, of their courts and harems, these are the pretexts for political statements about the West that cannot be spoken in political language. The social totality in this pre-capitalist late feudal world, a political totality rather than an economic one, will, in this Orientalist genre, find an expression that its successor, the capitalist economic totality, will not recover until the late capitalism of globalization meets the forms of science fiction and of subgenres like the mystery and the police procedural, as disreputable for official literary scholarship as were the Oriental tales of the emergent rationalist West itself in this strange period between two worlds, which was the 18th century. I conclude with a few thoughts about narrative as such. Srinivas joins me here in admiring two great essays on the tale. They are Todorov on the so-called homme récit, story people, I guess, and Benjamin on the storyteller. Both are, if not exactly orientalizing, then at least modernizing in their developmental telos. The tale is the older primitive form, the novel the modern one. Both see the tale as essentially preceding psychology, individualism, biography, the character in the narratological sense. For Todorov, the tale is marked by an acton or a named individual, distinguished by some unique event that has fatally marked him and endowed his mere name with some distinctive identity. For Benjamin, it's the event itself which is the center of the narrative and not the character at all. My own combination of these views identifies what is at stake in the tale as fate or destiny. And the presumption is that when the bourgeoisie invents a new kind of reading they call the novel, it replaces that sense of the irrevocability of fate with notions of development and pedagogy, the Bildungsroman, with that different biographical temporality, which is a life and a career, history rather than dynastic intrigue, marriage and the family rather than the harem, and the faits divers of the newspapers in place of those contingent accidents in which fate so often revealed itself. Unfortunately, with such theories, which oppose the anonymous tellers of tales to the rich individualism and subjectivity of novelistic protagonists, we're back in the most blatant Orientalism in its guise as the ideology of modernity, and so it is simply this is certainly the moment to break this off and seal this dangerous speculation thing.
What I've done is pull out a few things about genre and about time or about temporality, because it's something that I've been thinking about and something that I found this book speaks to in a really interesting way for me. So first, to talk a little bit about genre and temporality. It's a truism, but I think it's worth remembering that most genre theory is about time. We speak of the rise of the novel, and we've been speaking about that today, and we speak about things like the primary epic being eclipsed by the secondary epic, and so on. Genre in these situations is a practice of the imitation and revision of form over time. And given that, I think possibly the most forceful point that Enlightenment Orientalism makes is that it enables and exemplifies for us a genre theory that's about geography. Not the geography of mapping, of course, of a particular kind of mapping, in which different forms stake out different territories and defend them against all comers, but a mobile geography, a flow chart of circulation, porousness, and dispersal. It's this kind of mobility, the book demonstrates, that novel theory, even during the 18th century, militated against, and that it continues to do so even now. The book, Enlightenment Orientalism, focuses brilliantly, I think, on the cosmopolitanism attention to such mobility allows us to see. But it's not hard to extrapolate from the anxiety about the mobility of genres and stories to anxieties about other forms of migration that were rife during the long 18th century, to questions about refugees, emigrants, vagrants, and slaves. These worries, I suspect, creep into the policing of narrative forms that the book documents. And we can see it, for instance, in the episode that Srinivas talks about. Okay, here's a particularity of 18th century literature, the episode of the Gypsy King and Tom Jones, which I know you can all instantly bring to mind, but in Tom Jones Fielding's long novel, Tom and his friends encounter the gypsies, and they're brought into their caravan and told stories, and Fielding uses this as a way of critiquing British governmental forms. And a quote from Srinivas, he says, the gypsies were the continent's aboriginal travelers who appear in a cameo in Tom Jones that contrasts flawed English society with peripatetic Orientals as idealized foils. And in moments like this, I think Enlightenment Orientalism reminds us that we're so used to thinking of the novel as the signal and exemplary genre of the era that we forget just how badly it narrates migration. Or rather, we grow blind to the severe limits to its stories of human movement, diaspora, dispersal, and migration. There are very few novels, and I challenge you to think of even one, that tell of permanent movement. Robinson Crusoe comes home, so does Moll Flanders. Tom Jones returns to Paradise Hall. Even Matthew Bramble and Smollett's Humphrey Clinker goes home to Aberystwyth. And yet, such stories were more a fantasy of reinstatement than a reflection of the lived experience of people in the 18th century. This was an era of mass migration, from country to city, from old world to new, an era that severely policed the seeming rootlessness of gypsies and of the laboring poor. Literary criticism's focus on the novel tends to obscure the ubiquity of such movement, or to tell the story in particular and skewed ways. But I think the popularity and the persistence of the other narrative forms that Srinivas discusses in the book allows us to see things that might otherwise be invisible, including those forms of migration and the importance of them, and the fact that people might have wanted other stories to tell themselves other than the novel about their own lives and where they were going. Okay, then the second thing I wanted to talk about is more specifically even temporality and the novel. So in a slightly different direction, one thing that's been really helpful to me is not just the way the book turns the problem of genre away from time and towards space or towards geography, but also the book's analysis of different kinds of fictional temporalities. Enlightenment Orientalism, the book, reminds us how often we make the mistake of thinking that the 18th century knew where it was going, that it knew, somehow people knew, Defoe knew that the novel would triumph over other genres, or that it knew that its involvement, its nascent involvement in the East would eventuate in brutal colonialism, that was always present from the start, a kind of teleological force, but they didn't know, and the book, I think, brilliantly reminds us of that. And of course, it reminds us also that the 18th century itself invented this kind of history. It gave the name to the term Whiggish history. The Whigs were an 18th century group. It invented stadial history, in which cultures progressed from hunter-gatherers to civilized urban dwellers. It even invented graphical representations of this, including the time series line chart. The timeline was invented in the 18th century. So it was serious about inventing a certain kind of temporality. Novel theory in the present day has embraced this. In aspects of the novel, E.M. Forster claims that, quote, in a novel, there is always a clock. Ian Watt made a certain kind of representation of time one of the hallmarks of what he called formal realism, which was the way that he defined the novel. We have in the novel, says Watt, a sense of personal identity subsisting through duration and being changed by the flow of experience, end quote. And since Watt takes Defoe as a proof text of what a novel is, he might very well have been thinking of Defoe's uncharacteristic for Defoe, to use metaphorical representation of Moll Flanders when he wrote that. Moll, who imagines, quote, the flow of experience in Newgate when she's held in Newgate, quote, this is a quote from Moll Flanders, like waters in the cavities and hollows of the mountains, which petrifies and turns to stone whatever they are suffered to drop upon. And here in that passage, the steady drip of experience over time produces psychological changes. Here, in this case, a kind of deterioration as Moll sinks into the apathy shared by the other prisoners. And indeed, our sense of the realism, or what we have usually taken to be the realism of novelistic time, is usually bolstered by this kind of material image of something building up over time, like Moll's calcification, or of something wearing away. Often enough, that material image is a body. And think, and here's another 18th century example, think of the affective force attributed to Clarissa's body, for instance, when it wastes away under the shock of her violation. Even Lovelace, her rapist, would be affected, his friend claims, if he were to see, quote, to what a lovely skeleton he has in a few weeks reduced one of the most charming women in the world, and that in the full bloom of her youth and beauty. So the proof text here is her body that is empirically shown to diminish over time, and that's what temporality is in that novel. But that's not the only way that time is experienced, or the way that change is experienced, whether that change is moral or political. It's produced, as Srinivas's book shows, an attention to other narrative forms allows, An attention to other narrative forms allows both such temporalities to persist, allows other kinds of temporalities to persist, and in the book's terms, resist. In part, that resistance happens by the way that Oriental tales kind of play around with problems of temporality. Enlightenment Orientalism tells us not only about other ways to experience the past, but how the Oriental tale changes our ideas of the past. Like Susan Stewart, Srinivas calls the tale, quote, a distressed genre. And this is a quote from Enlightenment Orientalism. The Oriental tale simulates older models, just as distressed furniture simulates real antiques. Oriental tales have the capacity to, quote, plant remembered pasts, to insert alternate histories, and to give us other ways of thinking about time. And for this reason, I really love the book's reading of Francis Sheridan's novel, The History of Nourjahad, and it reads that narrative as a moral experiment that interrogates the relationship between genre, temporality, and moral instruction. And in that story, I have to say, one of the brilliant things about this book is Srinivas's ability to summarize all these stories succinctly and clearly, which is challenging. And I won't be able to duplicate it here, but The History of Nourjahad is a story where a sultan has a vizier who is not a good vizier. He's corrupt, and he decides to teach him a lesson, and he tricks him into thinking that 64 years have passed when really it's only 14 months by putting him to sleep. And every time he wakes up, he's like, oh, the people around him say, oh, this terrible thing has happened because of your misdeeds. You know, you should repent, and he does repent, and he goes back to sleep, and then he wakes up, they tell him more time has passed, more terrible things have happened, and he repents even further. Finally, at the end, they wake him up and they say, ha, it was all a joke, but the repentance stays with him. It turns out to be a useful way of teaching him something to mess with his idea of time like that. So revealing that quote, and this is to quote from the book, the timeline of 64 years has been a clever trick imposed on Nourjahad over the course of 14 months. The narrative substitutes performativity for novelistic narrativity. The time effects that Watt celebrates are all an act here. Thus, quote, time has been elongated artificially so that Nourjahad can learn the lessons of experience well before he grows old, because if he had to wait till he grew old, that would defeat the purposes of the Sultan, who orchestrates everything, who wishes to reprogram him as a competent vizier by speeding him through an artificial simulation. And the language here, I think, beautifully highlights how relevant these questions about temporality are for our contemporary concerns with entertainment and with education. How much can we do through artificial simulations that produce different kinds of experiences? Historicity is not the same as chronology, the book reminds us, and identity is not the same thing as experience. And to emphasize this point about persistent, alternate modes of representing experience and temporality and narrative, I wanted to just throw out an even later example of this that's not in the book, from Charles Maturin's novel of 1820 called Melmoth the Wanderer, which is a complicated Gothic novel that involves an immortal wanderer in a very complicated and episodic plot. I'm only talking about one episode. So Mansada, the Spaniard whose tale is the most detailed in this novel, is coerced into entering a monastery. One day, however, his half-brother offers him a chance to escape, and Mansada tries later to describe the intensity of his psychological experience of being offered this chance to escape. He says, "The day that followed, I have no more power of describing than of analyzing a dream to its component parts of sanity, delirium, defeated memory, and triumphant imagination. The Sultan in the Eastern tale who plunged his head in a basin of water, and before he raised it again, passed through adventures the most vicissitudinous and incredible, was a monarch, a slave, a husband, a widower, a father, childless, in 5 minutes, never underwent the changes of mind that I did during that memorable day." So that's a different tale that he's referencing than Nourjahad, but clearly it has similar elements and questioning of temporalities. So here Mansada struggles to describe an experience that resembles Nourjahad's more than it does Clarissa's. An experience, moreover, that arises from internal trauma rather than externally composed spectacle. The Eastern tale he alludes to comes to him by way of Joseph Addison, who tells it in Spectator 94 as part of his discussion of how we may lengthen our lives by study, reading, and the pursuits of knowledge. And Srinivas will have to tell us how the Addison story relates to Sheridan's. But already we can see that Monsada's experience is described through the non-temporal contiguity of illusion rather than through the metaphorics of physical objects, as we saw in Defoe. So already a different kind of temporality with regard to the psychological. In the Spectator paper, Addison is arguing that if Locke is right, quote, that our sense of time is produced by the train of ideas which succeed one another in our minds, end quote, we can prolong our lives by having more ideas. He, Addison, illustrates this point with two stories taken from the Turkish tales published in English in 1708, which are discussed in Srinivas's book, in the second of which an infidel Egyptian sultan is taught God's powers by living a whole lifetime in the time it takes to put his head in a bowl of water and pull it out. Addison concludes by asking his readers, quote, to compare these Eastern fables with the notion of those two great philosophers whom I've quoted in this paper, that's Locke and Malebranche, and to consider how we may extend life beyond its natural dimensions by applying ourselves diligently to the pursuits of knowledge. But I think it's interesting that Addison, as an early 18th century writer, feels the need to illustrate his philosophical point about time with literary allusions. And more interesting, that both his examples come not from representations of time that were developing into the realist novel at just this moment, but from, quote, Oriental tales. It's important to note that Maturin, the 19th century author, pulls this example into his own late Romantic text to explain the temporality of traumatic experience. Novelistic representations of temporality have never been enough to comprehend experience, and we lose something when we blind ourselves to other forms. The 18th century knew this, as we can see by the use of illusions here, but I think it's been part of the great forgetting of later periods that has occluded our vision of these things. And I'm grateful to Enlightenment Orientalism for bringing them back to enable us to see these things. So Enlightenment Orientalism has had a significant impact on the way and I think we all think about national boundaries in literature. I think of it almost as a literary critical equivalent to the political movement of no borders, the idea of abolishing national borders. But what I've been saying should indicate that I wonder, and this is my question for Srinivas, what impact it would also have on current investigations of temporality. I wonder what would happen if we thought about its reconsideration of narrative, representation, and temporality in relation to current scholarship on the discovery of deep time, transhuman time, and things like the Anthropocene.
I don't know how well many of you know Srinivas, but the first time I met him, I was giving a talk innocently at Cornell on something that became a book on the novel called Licensing Entertainment, and this outrageously self-confident graduate student stood up in the back of the room and asked a really hard question, and that was Srinivas Aravamudan. So it's been fun knowing him since then. Enlightenment Orientalism is a groundbreaking book in at least three ways. It offers a political critique of realism, one that, Fredric Jameson has told us he's not molested by, but I'm glad to be molested by. It develops a practice of reading attuned to the novels of Enlightenment Orientalism. And finally, it prototypes a critical epistemology that expands the reality that we can know through fiction. Part one, a political critique of realism. Srinivas criticizes the rise of the novel thesis not for its failures to understand novel form, realism, nations, or middle-class subjectivity. Instead, Srinivas challenges what the rise of the novel thesis has achieved, a hegemonic framing narrative that is both descriptive and normative for critics, readers, and writers. So, in part, he does this, Srinivas's book seeks to undo that hegemony, which is obviously a complicated kind of process. In part, Srinivas does this by challenging the outsized claims made in novel studies for realism. And it extends to other media, of course. Traditional rise of the novel critics have valued realism as a kind of virtual reality, which offers a simulation in language of the visual bias of Western epistemology, evident from the Renaissance elaboration of linear perspective and 3D shading through the minute descriptive description of Enlightenment's systematic natural histories, and with their gorgeous illustrations, to 19th century photography and 20th century cinema. In all of these, what is most valued about representation is its power to create a compelling illusion that can stand as an experiential equivalent for reality. These realist claims were often tendered in the 18th century through an adaptation of the French word vraisemblance, which I want to emphasize means seeming truth, translated into English as verisimilitude. Novels by this theory must be plausibly real, a virtual reality that looks or sounds real but is not. Against the hegemony of the realist novel, Srinivas deploys satire to objectify and attack realism as enclosing, parochial, and finally, not the culmination, but instead a reduction of the inventive power of fiction. Here's a sample of his satire, and I'm going to try to do it as over the top as possible. Rather than inventing fiction, the realist novel destroyed it. Once this veto of the fictional managed to herd readers like so many stray cats into the nationalist realist enclosure, normativity kicked in, using the novel and the newspapers to establish a daily plebiscite on national matters clocked within a single calendrical time, end quote. This satire, I think, has the same motive as 18th century satire and satire ever since, to challenge our conscious and unconscious attachments by teasing us out of our fighting faith in realism, thereby expanding what we can know. Part 2, a more capacious literary history. In this book, Srinivas returns to the archive of the novel and the history of reading to document what the modernizing rise of the novel thesis has done, starting in the later 18th century, but as earlier commentators have pointed out, doing it mostly retrospectively and retroactively through the 19th and 20th century. Srinivas shows that critics and literary historians have achieved their modernizing goals by applying a filter to the early novels of the 17th and 18th century. To be a real novel, it should be local, national, empirically plausible, probable, concerned with self-formation, trace the coherence of social life and manners, and you can keep adding to that list. And this is what Bruno Latour calls the modernization front. You know, you gobble up things and turn them in a certain direction. This normative definition of the novel abjects the Oriental tale, fable, parable as false, fantasy-laden, extravagant, and perhaps finally thin and boring. To challenge this tendentious placement of the Oriental tale, Srinivas asked, why did so many successful 18th century writers also write Oriental tales? I mean, starting with a kind of basic fact. Using the category realism to purify the novel has had the effect of removing from view a large, popular, and culturally influential body of texts that Srinivas organizes around a practice he calls, it's a kind of discursive practice called Enlightenment Orientalism. Within this practice of literary history, positioning or orienting one's curiosity, thought, and fantasy toward the Orient, and he uses this pun discreetly, was for many writers of the Enlightenment fundamental, renovating, and valuably reflective. For these writers, the watchword was not, go west, young man or woman, where you will find, toward a new creation evermore about to be, which is the sort of allure of the West, the new, the modern, but instead reorient your gaze toward the Orient, where you will find what the East has always promised, wisdom from its history, its difference, and yes, from its knowledge, which has long been deposited in books and languages, places, and people of the Orient. There's something new in this looking toward the East in the Enlightenment, and this is something Srinivas insists on and he'll get into arguments about with others. Unlike earlier medieval or later romantic Orientalism, Enlightenment thinkers did not turn to the Orient for the exotic, or at least primarily for the exotic. So there's several interrelated aspects of this argument alluded to earlier by the commentators here. Although knowledge of the Orient was fragmentary and subject to bizarre appropriations, neither was it simply a fantasy projection of the Occident, and this is where there's a departure from Said. Many factors, from trade to political exchange to the development of more systematic knowledge, were steadily expanding points of contact and increasing familiarity with the Orient. Thus, for Western writers practicing Enlightenment Orientalism, there was a genuine admiration for not just the vast wealth and scale of the Ottoman Empire, India, and China, but for their culture and knowledge. Secondly, the writing and translation of enormously popular works like The Turkish Spy and The Arabian Nights reflect and extend this appreciation to the literary sphere, where these texts implanted in the Occident new techniques and tropes to think and write with. Engagement with the Orient, Srinivas concedes, was often largely imaginary, but Srinivas adds this imagination was experimental, perspective, and anti-foundationalist, and the Enlightenment comparative perspective was neoclassical in its inclusion of Oriental cultures, religions, practices, and polities.
Novelism, as Clifford Siskin has named the overwhelming bias towards the genre as the constitutive vehicle of modernity, has now receded with the emergence of powerful forms of narrative such as feature film, interactive video games, and other new media. Are we at a post-novelistic moment from where we can look back at the history of the novel and at the history of fictional genres with a new perspective? Watts' teleology was by no means unproductive. It was a powerful theoretical machete that cleared a lot of the undergrowth, allowing for the erection of a spare English canon, of Defoe, Richardson, and Fielding, capped by Jane Austen, that has since been criticized for its masculinism and avant-gardism. The rise of the novel had great cross-field appeal beyond the minor local skirmishes amongst period scholars. If Watts' contribution was a misreading, it was a powerful and a consequential one that brought a lot of positive attention to a field, and most important, energized new generations of scholars who built several stories upon the platform he laid. Stories, E-Y. It brought history and theory together powerfully, as Michael McKean has argued, even as it overemphasized a British empiricist claim to the global trajectory of one national realist fiction writ large as universalist script. But in many respects, Watt also had powerful theoretical predecessors from the continental tradition who were staking their own claims about the novel as an engine of modernity. Georgi Lukács, Ortega y Gasset, and Mikhail Bakhtin. To slightly loosen the Anglo-centric grip on this meta-narrative by switching from the effectivity of the novel to that of the Oriental tale as a parallel engine of modernity, and devoting equal attention to the French 18th century, as I have done, still leaves a bigger problem of Eurocentrism to confront that I've only partially addressed. But I think Fred helped me by saying that Eurocentrism is a name for capitalism, so maybe. Structures once built cannot be dismantled entirely without a cost. My overall aim was not to write a counter-history of the novel, but to stage multiple interrogations of the realist paradigm via intergenres, with the Oriental tale being my prime exhibit. Enlightenment Orientalism is an interruptive literary history that contests the exposition of British national realism and novelism with comparativist energies drawn from what is increasingly a post-novelistic moment. At the same time, just as much as Watts' ground clearing made short shrift of many writers, my emphasis veers away from national realism and toward non-novelistic prose genres, promising transcultural access. More about that below. I've stayed close to the Oriental tale as intergenre, albeit within broader prose fiction contexts, even as I have not strayed into full-scale exploration of Orientalist drama, lyric, music, painting, furniture, gardening, and popular culture, vast as the topic Orientalism is. As Fredric Jameson has recently argued, realism has always been contrasted with a host of opponents: epic, romance, idealism, modernism, Oriental tale. And yet realism's tenacious continuation does not makes it a kind of straw man against which other genre epistemologies can cut their teeth. My study of the Oriental tale is itself a thought experiment, akin to many of the Oriental fictions that I analyze. A provisional exercise in a universe of dynamic cultural interaction, rather than a finished statement about a singular reality. We have many overlapping language games being played in genre history, many microhistories and generic protocols to follow up, and several open-ended ideological frameworks still awaiting disentanglement and re-entanglement with newer epistemologies and genealogies. It's my second section called Post-Orientalism Transversality. Having faced dismissal by partisans of national realism and avant-gardists who used realist novels as the privileged vehicle for modernity narratives, the 18th century Oriental tale has suffered additional stigmatization since the powerful intervention made by Edward Said's Orientalism. Saidianism spurred retroactive applications of anti-Orientalism as the ideological detoxification of genre history. Orientalism urges vigilance about the nexus between power and knowledge, and yet the mechanical applications of the conclusions to periods and genres that antedate the high imperial era has been problematic, to say the least. If to resist the rise of novel was a particular way of swimming against the current, opposing the generalized political and cultural interpretations of representations of Europe's eastern flank is altogether another endeavor. The fusion of two apparent opposites, Enlightenment and Orientalism, appealed to me as a powerful heuristic, an apparent oxymoron actually revealed as a secret alliance, leading to eventual critical insight. While Watt did not talk explicitly about the Enlightenment, the modernity narrative he promulgated took it largely as given. Genres apparently retarded from the perspective of modernity have also been doubly dismissed or relegated as suspect for containing negative stereotypes and inaccurate histories of, quote, the Orient. In this secondary rush to judgment, 19th and 20th century conventions were again applied to 18th century artifacts that were then found wanting. The more I investigated the valence of these tales, the more I discovered that Orientalism, at least 18th century Orientalism of fictional nature, was a crucial part of the practice of Enlightenment disorientation and defamiliarization. 18th century Oriental tales used, quote, the Orient as a movable rather than fixed target to unsettle the binaries of West and East rather than reinforce them. The Fontenellian structure of a plurality of worlds was extant, and I built upon that framework to demonstrate the flexible nature of these worlding representations. These texts were recursive forms of pleasure and flexible forms of apprehension during a time when anthropological knowledge was still scanty and aspirations concerning elsewhere were highly uneven. When there was still significant work to be done to undermine political despotism within Europe using indirect forms of representation. Post-Orientalist vantage points allow us to see that Orientalism is neither static nor univocal, nor even always easily decoded in political terms. This is my final section, and it's called Postmodernism Transculturation. Our current vantage point allows modernist as well as postmodernist methodological avenues for newer interpretation. Watt's take on realism was more modernist than realist, insofar as it took formal realism to be an aesthetic and epistemological vehicle, instead of asserting the formlessness of immediate reality and the unvarnished truth claims of individual testimony, as the genre-bending novel writers of the 18th century proclaimed. So I think formal realism is an important, the formal part of realism is an important part of his claim. In this context, the pleonasm of transculturation, as it is used in my study, is something to be explained. Indeed, the transcultural is rarely delivered as the content in these tales, that are better delivering the third space of experimental innovation more than the second space of the putative Orient, with the first space being that of domestic national realism that the Oriental tale rejects. So there are three spaces, first space, which is a domestic national, second space, which is supposedly that of the Orient, but which doesn't really show up, and the third space, which is the experimental, innovative space. Here, the self-conscious critique might be reiteration of the symptom rather than a realist alternative to it. In an earlier study, Tropicopolitans, that was mentioned, I characterized one of the great Orientalist texts of the 18th century, Mary Wortley Montagu's Turkish Embassy Letters, as a form of Levantinization. Montague, who attempts to pass over into Ottoman high culture, ultimately returns with her experience as a literary commodity. Using Victor Turner's anthropological application of William Van Gennep's important understandings of transculturation, we can discern that an experience of liminality, perhaps the holy grail of genuine content-oriented transculturation, is reconverted into what Turner calls the liminoid, virtual transculturation, rather than transculturation tout court. The Oriental tale is ultimately a liminoid intergenre. Sorry for the jargon, but I think the word liminoid is important here. And whatever transculturation it offers is a hybrid cosmopolitan vehicle anchored in a refusal of the first space of Europe and oriented toward a third space yet to be articulated. To that degree, Orientalist representations of this fictional type are in danger of subsequently standing in as ersatz for the second space, even though that space was initially available more as fantasy than reality. Of course, such tales can be seen as eliding a genuine anthropology and thwarting, quote, real access to the other, whoever that may be. Sorry, that was meant to be a joke. But that failure should not devalue the importance of these fictions. If anything, the standard critical move from these textual representations to actual histories of the areas they represent pose the greater danger of misrecognition and involves the tedium of constantly correcting earlier distortions. You know, like people say, oh, this is not what they really like. And the question is that the issue here? And it's not necessarily at all. And that kind of activity keeps certain kind of Saidianism of the mechanical type very busy. And I wouldn't say that was true of Said, but it's certainly true of a certain kind of school that's developed where they say, aha, look, these writers don't represent these people as they actually are, and bad on them. And I'm not into that kind of thing. So literary history, this is my last paragraph. Literary history can never lose its temporal situation and cannot shake itself free of Nachtraglichkeit, the retroactive agency of deferred action. Postmodernism does not free us of the Enlightenment, but makes multiple temporalities collide, even as we are drawn back within the Enlightenment complex. The reading subject is psychoanalytically regrounded, neither achieving pure identification with the past nor breaking entirely free of it. Excuse my horrendous cold. In this way, the 18th century, read as an anticipation of the postmodern, is transcultural but liminoid. The vacuity of liminoid experience connects with the weak power of literature rather than the direct appeal of politics, making available to us a gestural aesthetics that is subtle and indirect. This typifies the transcultural universal of Enlightenment Orientalism. Thank you.
It looks like what you're opposing to the novel is not another kind of novel, but is the short story. And so I wonder if you could, and that's a genre that has a completely different gesturality and maybe meaning
It's
and
not
so on.
necessarily the short story, though, Fred. I mean, the short story
The
is
tale, let's say.
the tale, but it's also, non-realist novels, some of which are, like The Persian Letters is a novel,
yeah.
but it's not realist in the traditional sense. It's sort of partly satirical, partly allegorical, and it's epistolary. So it is a roman, but not a novel. And I think that's what, so can you?
Well, I would like to add to the notion of the story or the tale, the episodic, because it seems to me that's how it gets into novels like that. And seeing time as episodic is surely quite different from the way the novel finally manages to construct time. So, and that's where I sort of come out with Todorov and Benjamin in the end of my comment, and where you come out really a little bit.
Yeah, I'm very influenced by those readings of the tale. I think Todorov put it very well in Les Hommes Récits, which is that it's not the character for which he uses Henry James as the example, where the novel is all about the character. He said it's not about the character, it's about action. And so action exists only in order to advance to the next level of action, and the character is purely a means to action. Whereas in a classic psychological novel, the action doesn't have to happen except as a vindication of character. And what you're really trying to understand is, I mean, I think the way the novel is defined is it's a biography of some sort. At least that's one kind of novel, and Bakhtin describes like 7 or 8 types, but the biography is the classic version because it's all about trying to understand a human being in full psychological complexity and subjectivity. I think tales are all about action and what actions explain to you about life and other things, but they don't fetishize character, to go to the idea of fetish. And I don't think there are novels without characters that are, you know, the whole idea of the rounded character, which is really important for a certain kind of subjective novel.
Aristotle says you don't do a tragedy about a character, you do the unity, the principle of unity of a tragedy is the action. And the characters are ancillary to the real subject of the tragedy or the poem should be the action. Then we're caught in the fallacies of modernization, whereby we would have the tale as the older model, the model before modernization, between the revolution of status of fiction, going from a poetic regime to the new aesthetic regime with the triumph of the novel. So the question then becomes, how much of these tales are a kind of resistance of past forms to a new construction of fiction, a new understanding of fiction?
I think it's interesting and important to understand that in the 18th century, the same public was being chased by both Robinson Crusoe and 1001 Nights. I mean, they were all being published serially in the magazines as fictions. And I don't think one can actually do its work without the role of the other. So I think it's about multiple types of fictions and fictional genres that need to be articulated in the same space that actually lend each other a kind of relative weight. And to declare that one of them was a winner and the others are all losers and don't need to be read is the biggest mistake that I think subsequent critics did. It was after Walter Scott, it was really the 19th century that looked back and said, where did our novels come from? They came from these, from Defoe, Richardson, you know, that kind of thing. And they didn't realize the way in which the period actually had a wealth of genres, fictional and non-fictional genres, that worked off of each other. And so it's that range. I mean, I'm not a partisan for the Oriental tale, by the way. If that's what came across, I hope you realize that that's wrong. I was just using it polemically as a wedge to go after the realist novel. But just in order to clear some space so that we can understand that this kind of genre Darwinism is a bizarre way to proceed.
Returning to Charlotte's observation that genre theory is very much about time, I was wondering how much we can consider geography through the lens of temporality, and to think about the way that in the 19th century the approach to Orientalism is really dominated by the trope of ruins in a way that isn't exactly the same in the 18th century, and it's an interesting transition. And then moving from that to contemporary popular culture, I wondered what you think of the Marco Polo series by Netflix as the new Orientalism.
I don't know what the Marco Polo. Sorry. No, I mean, I agree that it's actually all about, you know, genre and temporality. But I think it's also the way in which a certain kind of English novel theory uses Bakhtin both to, you know, to kind of make a point about why the novel is this usurper. And then once the usurper gets the throne, then they're royalists. They don't want any threats to the regime. And you know, I think that's kind of crazy because you have to use all of these different types of writing. And Bakhtin, you know, his definition of novel is incredibly negative in the sense it's whatever is is threatening or challenging the established genre hierarchy.
But it's also renovating and expansive and utopian.
Right.
And I had a section that I had to cut for time reasons called "Queering the Novel" with Bakhtin, because your book is rigorously Bakhtinian. I mean, it carries Bakhtin's logic to its farthest extent. And I just wanted to ask you, this came out of the last sentence of my response. It seemed to me your attack on the nationalist realist novel in England, which would have to be done, of course, differently. It's done somewhat differently in your book with France, but in every country, points to the fact that you're not a comparatist who wants to produce a kind of multinational theory of the novel, but to actually shake people loose from these attachments to their national tradition and the national institution of literary studies, and so that one could actually think a world literature. And then, for example, one could not make that argument simply with, saying plot and action are more important than character, sort of in other traditions, because as Fred Jameson just pointed out, The Dream of the Red Chamber is being written in China, and it has a good deal of character development and in a very nuanced way. And The Tale of Genji, several centuries earlier, is centrally about character from a sort of Buddhist point of view. So it wouldn't be that the terms that you use for this critical operation would be universally applicable across world literature. But my question is that the agenda? In some sense, this is offering a toolkit for people wanting to think beyond the bipolarity, East Orient, Occident Orient, to some kind of category of world literature?
No, I agree with you. I mean, it's all about trying to get to world literature, but that's not infected by national traditions in a particular way in which they're constructed vertically. It's about trying to move across borders and boundaries. I have an article about this in 18th century studies, the one that looks at Haib and Yaksan, in the way that science and empiricism is very much at stake in the early modern period, and how they end up sort of questioning novelistic realism just as much as scientific realism.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.